This is the Pokemon. We've got a major remake here, as we're taking on the original secret Pokemon, Mew, long before it was a pseudoscientific looks-maxing TikTok trend, and around the same time of the origin of the Danish rock band of the same name actually, Mew had more wild explanations surrounding it than Mulholland Drive. If you weren't around back in the day, you didn't experience the insane rumors around this Pokemon. It was an intentionally badly kept secret, as there were supposed to only be 150 Pokemon. But what's this rumor about the 151st that may or may not exist? This kind of thing led to all sorts of playground myths back in the 90s that somehow spread across the world. Like, the most famous one being, of course, that Mew was found under the truck in Vermilion City. In the trading card game, Mew also had inarguably the coolest card of them all, the Ancient Mew, and of course, the first Pokemon film, a masterpiece of cinema even the late great David Lynch would have been proud to have made. Centered around the epic battle between Mew and his clone, one could say doppelganger, Mewtwo. Also, the only way to get this card was of course to go see the movie. Putting aside the blue velvet of Mew's identity crisis and psychic damage in that movie, join us in Mew the Return, where we traverse the lost highway of competitive Pokemon to see if Mew ruled over its inland empire or had its head erased. And so we ask, how great was Mew actually? And in this video, we'll be going over these competitive formats. Gen 1ers are thrilled by the Gen 1 Uber's landscape, as it is effectively a recreation of the first Pokemon movie, Mewtwo and Mew duking it out. That's oversimplifying it, of course, but it's also quite accurate. Though Mewtwo may be the original Uber, Mew is right up there with it, the other of the two Pokemon banned from standard play, and the other of two Pokemon required on every serious Uber's team. Because, what are you going to use that's better than it? Nothing. Funnily enough, since Mew isn't as outrageously broken as Mewtwo, there exists a format called Mewbers, which is basically Ubers minus Mewtwo, or OU plus Mew, however you want to refer to it. You can have a somewhat balanced OU tier with Mew in it, but then again, you can also have a somewhat balanced Uber tier with Mewtwo in it. Just like that doesn't mean Ubers should be the standard tier, a discussion that has popped up over the generations, so too doesn't mean that Mew shouldn't be an OU, as it is indeed a little too good at doing everything, with its flawless mono-psychic typing, peerless move pool, and superb stats across the board. Think of all of your Gen 1 OU mainstays, and consider how Mew generally both bulldozes and stonewalls them. In Ubers, Mew is excellent for two reasons. One, it can help deal with Mewtwo, which of course assists in enabling one's own Mewtwo. And two, it is a ferocious threat in its own right. It does both of these things thanks to Swords Dance, which is rare in Gen 1, and the physical approach lets it target Mewtwo's unboosted defense stat, as well as do something Mewtwo can't, or other psychics like Exeggutor and Slowbro for that matter, with Exeggutor's psychic being way stronger and Slowbro having Amnesia to boost. So between Swords Dance Mew and Amnesia Mewtwo, each team is starting out with the scariest physical sweeper and scariest special sweeper, and a lot of the time, their best answers tend to be themselves. Anyone who's ever played a metagame with Landorus Styrian will know what this is like. Now, while Mew is always using Swords Dance and is always consistent in doing so because of how inherent its strong matchups against nearly everything are, it has plenty of variety to trip opponents up further. The standard of Earthquake, Body Slam, and Soft Boiled was difficult to go wrong with, blending the most ideal attacks for the job with the reliability of recovery, but one could also push things further. Body Slam could be replaced with Hyper Beam, and Soft Boiled could be replaced with Explosion, both lending themselves to greater aggression and especially helpful against big Mewtwo. Then you could go the opposite route entirely and focus on bulking Mew out. Forget blowing it up with Exeggutor or Snorlax, because Mew could also run a mono-attacking Swords Dance Soft Boiled set with both Body Slam and Earthquake being great options, and in the last slot went Reflect, making Mew impenetrable on the physical side. Mew mirrors could get messy, but were generally prolonged wars of attrition. Mew could also add some support to its all-out Swords Dance antics by throwing Thunder Wave in the mix, paralyzing opponents more immediately than Body Slam before going on its Swords Dance boom rampage. Mew also had a very unusual set without Swords Dance, well, in the literal sense, as its goal was still to get a Swords Dance, just in a very roundabout way. It could attempt to counter opposing Swords Dance Mew through Thunder Wave, Reflect, Soft Boiled, and Transform. Yes, you heard that right. Mew could counter the opposing Mew, then transform into the opposing Mew, so as to safely steal its Swords Dance boost and coverage for itself, while also benefiting from Reflect. Convoluted and risky? You bet. But Mew is the only Pokemon besides Smeargle to have ever used Transform successfully at all, so it bears worth mentioning, gimmicky as the set was. Ultimately though, just about every serious Gen 1 Ubers team would have a Swords Dance Mew on it, and it would put in work on a game-to-game basis, this, with how its attributes towered over just about anything else. It couldn't help but be elite. Mew was no longer quite as essential in Gen 2 Ubers, but it sure was up there. Instead of being on literally every team, it was now only on almost every team. It was still swords dancing up as ever though, and now with an excellent new tool in Shadow Ball, with which it could smack opposing psychics, not just Mew, but newcomers Lugia and Celebi as well. It also incorporated other moves into its moveset now viable since it didn't need Shadow Ball to deal with the psychics. Rock Slide was common as a Lugia hitting alternative that destroyed Ho-Oh and smacked Zapdos, while Submission was useful to take on King Snorlax, as well as the new Dark types in Umbreon and Tyranitar, the latter of which was hit much harder than by Earthquake. Both Slide and Submission were useful to threaten Cloyster after a boost as well. Furthermore, the addition of Leftovers was pleasant for offsetting recoil and generally making it easier for Mew to set up Swords Dance, and it proceeded with business as usual, especially with the newly added spikes assisting in providing chip damage on its targets. This is another reason Rock Slide was popular, because it synergized so nicely with spikes by hitting the flyers immune to them. Of course, seeing as Mewtwo was once again a top tier terror, Mew often used Shadow Ball so it can make use of its ability to switch into it by threatening damage on it, after a boost of course. Mew added a new element to its game beyond simply acting as an extension of its Gen 1 Swords Dancing element. It's still Swords Dance on this set, yes, but it did so in the lead position. This was significant because its status as a less essential Pokemon in this new metagame meant it could be more cavalier with unleashing huge damage on the opponent early through boosted explosions, and this all-out playstyle meant it didn't have to bother with Leftovers, but could instead go with Miracle Berry, the Gen 2 equivalent of Lumberry, so forget shutting it down with sleep or paralysis. It was especially nice for Swords Dancing in the face of a lovely Kiss Snorlax and then immediately threatening to drop it with Boom, and because it's Mew, it could do whatever it wanted. So what physical attacks did it run alongside Boom? Why, none of course. It started with Thunder Wave because Thunder Wave was always a good idea. Yes, that means once the set took off, you saw two Mew repeatedly trading Thunder Waves in the lead slot fairly often. If a tanky steal like Skarmory, Steelix, or Fortress came in to save off any Swords Dance Boom antics, they'd get shredded by Fire Blast for their trouble. Alternatively, Mew could punish Cloyster with Thunder, committing to the concept by running Magnet as its item to go from 35.9% chance to one-hit KO to 89.7%, accuracy notwithstanding of course. Regardless of the role it took on, Mew was still a similarly elite Pokemon in the second generation of Ubers, no longer mandatory, but quite close to it, as it was still a top 3 Pokemon only behind Snorlax and Mewtwo. Advance's burst of offense suddenly made Mew look quite quaint. Forget its Swords Dance set in this, the world of Choice Band Deoxys attack. Plus, DOA aside, Swords Dance Mew could not keep up in this brave new world of Groudon, Kyogre, and their Weatherfield antics, as well as the general dominance of the Soul Dew Laddie twins. Its power, speed, and bulk, while not bad, paled in comparison. Being a physical Mewtwo light was no longer good enough. If one were to use Mew, they'd use it as a lead with Explosion that would play fast and aggressive, ready to blow up quickly before it could be overwhelmed by the tier's massive new power level. It could take just about any one hit from full health, and with Thunder Wave threatened ruin on offensive pokes, while Thunder and Fire Blast ensured it had a solid move to spam against steals regardless of the weather. Of course, these moves also let it throw some decent damage out without immediately having to blow up, but their primary purpose was to enable that boom to go off against a Pokemon that didn't resist normal. Why would you use this Mew over the similarly Mewtwo then, which was much faster and stronger? Because you wanted to use Mewtwo later in the game, of course, and this is why you could blow up your first Mewtwo, kinda, and still have the real deal waiting in the wings. This wasn't a bad strategy, but it was very rare, and most of the time, the Mew you'd see in the lead slot was Mewtwo, which was indeed one of the best leads in Gen 3 Ubers. Funnily enough, this massive increase in power creep led many to wonder if Mew would be appropriate in OU, much like its fellow base 100 Pixies, Jirachi, and eventually Celebi. Some tournaments with it allowed were played, although ultimately, it was decided that Mew's move pool would be too much for standard play. It could Calm Mind, it could Swords Dance, it could go the utility route, and each of these variants would have a ton of variety within them, making for a Pokemon that would be too difficult to consistently deal with its stats and its typing, which at this time of Special Pursuits and physical Shadow Balls was still difficult to take advantage of. Sure, you might have some teams that would do well against Mew, but the same argument was made for another Pokemon that was considered, yet ultimately deemed too broken, Latias without Soul Dew. Mew was even more outclassed in the power department, with Gen 4's onslaught of Life Orb, Choice Specs, Draco Meteor, and Boosted Outrage that reached their apex in the Uber tier. But it was actually better in this new generation thanks to some superb additions to its utility move pool, ones that couldn't be replicated by Mewtwo. Mew's primary use in the Gen 4 tradition was as a stealth rock lead that also wielded other classics of the position in Explosion, Taunt to stop hazards from slower leads like Fortress, and it could actually slot in Fire Blast for Fortress if it liked, but Taunt also had a mid-game use against rockers like Dialga and Groudon, so it was preferred. It also had U-Turn, which was the reason it both wasn't outclassed by and didn't lose to the gatekeeper of the lead meta, Deoxys Speed. Deoxys Speed wouldn't want to risk Taunt on a U-Turn into the strong priority of a teammate like Shadow Snake Giratina Origin or Choice Band Scizor, which would stop it from getting any hazards at all. Mew could play it safe and U-Turn, or it could take advantage of this and get rocks. Mostly though, Mew enjoyed how its bulk let it set up rocks without needing a sash in the face of even massively hard hitters like Rayquaza, Kyogre, Ho-Oh, and even Darkrai, which let it safely run Lumberry to pop up rocks even against the latter's Dark Void. Mew's threatening explosion prompted many teams to try and block it with their own Giratina Origin, which a good Mew user could take advantage of with U-Turn. Mew was an excellent lead for many offensive teams, anchoring them with ample early and mid-game utility. However, Mew had one other niche in Diamond and Pro Ubers, and this one was rare but absolutely despised when it did appear: the Baton Passer. It functioned exactly like Baton Pass Gliscor, which had such controversy in OU with its double boost passing strategy, and what made it particularly absurd to deal with was the support that it got from none other than Mewtwo, whose blazing fast dual screens, taunt, and self-destruct ensured Mew hit the field safely, ready to both boost and pass those boosts while surviving even the strongest attacks around. Mew would rock polish first, so it would block your fast tricks or taunts or whatever with its own taunt, then it would Swords Dance. Thanks to its impressive bulk alongside dual screens, it was so tanky, it could often get up 2 Swords Dances, but even one would be more than enough to suffice for its pass to Groudon, and the game would be over because a Groudon coming in at full health already with a +2 attack and speed under its belt was just absurd. Later, Mew would up the ante. Instead of Swords Dance, it would pass Nasty Plots to Dialga, which swept even more easily thanks to its sturdier defensive profile and the fact that it didn't have to rely on inaccurate moves like Groudon did if it wanted to crush Lugia. Either way, as soon as the dual screens Mewtwo came out, everyone knew what was up, and the Baton Pass Mew user was chastised for their cheese. Eventually, a major Gen 4 Ubers tournament was held with Baton Pass banned entirely so as to not have the competition ruined. It didn't happen officially, but seeing Gen 4 Ubers was only played by enthusiasts of the tier after the generation was finished, it was considered a low blow to use such a cheap strategy in such a niche format, as past gen non-OU tiers are, so it was naturally rare, although there was always someone. Lastly, Mew was once again lightly considered for OU at certain points, though never anything seriously. Certainly not to the extent of any tournament being held for it or anything. The stall breaker set a la Mewtwo and Ubers with Taunt, Will-O-Wisp, and Soft-Boiled would be agonizingly difficult to handle for so much, especially with knockoff in the last slot, while the Nasty Plot set would have an obnoxiously limiting effect on the team builder as well. The most broken thing in the tier? Maybe not, but as was the case with its new fellow base 100 Pixie Manaphy, that didn't mean it would be a healthy addition. Generation 4 saw Mew finally out of Ubers, but forget any questions of it challenging OU's brokenness threshold because it actually dropped as far as UU, and nobody had any complaints there. Gen 5 power creep aside, Mew got to flaunt the fullest extent of its excellence in UU and OU alike. Despite not being OU proper, it was still an important Pokemon in the tier, one that had to be taken into consideration lest it completely ruin an entire team, and that's exactly what happened for many Sand Squads, as well as just about all Dragmag teams against Mew's flagship set, the Taunt Will-O-Wisp variant, adapted from Mewtwo's flagship Quickstaller in the previous generation of Ubers. This set was an absolute nightmare for offense and stall alike. If the latter lacked Heat Ran, they were almost certainly toast, completely unable to scratch it, while it effortlessly wore them down, while many offenses struggled to break through its bulk and burns, especially with the immediacy it offered against major threats in Gliscor, Garchomp, Dragonite, and Landorus Incarnate, replaced in Black and White 2 after its ban by its Therian counterpart thanks to to Ice Beam, ensuring Gliscor's Poison Heal wouldn't be able to stifle its Wisp, while also providing further presence against Thundurus, Tornadus, and Latios. Many teams desperately flung their Tyranitar, Rotom Wash, Latios at Mew, managing the barest of threats while really just playing into Mew's hands with the burns they suffered. But then again, what else were they to do? Most other options were even more ruined. Mew's speed made it especially terrific for its anti-offense role, as it didn't need to max out its bulk to be a great hit taker, and without much effort could make itself fast enough to outrun the standards of Jolly Breloom and Adamant Dragonite. You could use Mew to great effect on many different teams. It most commonly and notoriously fit on sand balances, both with and without spikes, but it also featured on several weatherless spikes defense teams, with its amazing defensive reach helping compensate for its team's lack of weather. Furthermore, it had streaks of anchoring some of the meta's more successful rain stalls, lending them an edge against other stall teams, as well as helping answer one of their greatest enemies, Calm Mind Reuniclus. Mew in Rain also enjoyed the fact that it could actually heal with leftovers. Indeed, this fact led some players to even try it to success on Bulky Sun. Whatever it was used though, Mew helped take on a serious murderer's row of targets: dragons, fighters, grounds, and psychics. You know, the strongest, most defining offensive types besides water in Gen 5 OU. Even when it wasn't hard countering Pokemon like Alakazam, its excellent bulk helped pivot around it beautifully. Mew had some other useful sets in OU too. Tailwind offense was actually seen a small handful of times, and Mew led the charge on such teams, popping rocks and Tailwind up before unleashing a normal gem explosion to get its Tailwind abusing teammates like Kyurem Black in with a bang. Nasty Plot Mew had some coverage issues, but if you could reconcile the ability to fit all of Fire Blast, Aura Sphere, Soft Boiled, and Ice Beam alongside Plot and Psychic, it had great potential to catch opponents off guard. There were even funky sets like Swords Dance, Flame Charge, Drain Punch, and Baton Pass. Mew could do pretty much anything, but ultimately, it was defined by the Taunt Will-O-Wisp variant that made it arguably the single scariest non-OU Pokemon in OU. In UU, Mew was one of the very best Pokemon. Its Taunt Whiff set functioned much the same. If OU struggled to take it out, how do you think UU fared? Answer: not too well. Mew threatened to choke out entire teams. Yeah, Victini was immune to Will-O-Wisp, but Victini also got ruined by Stealth Rock. Plus, Mew could even slot an Earthquake over the usual Psych Shock or Psychic if it was so inclined, which was also useful for letting it beat Substitute Raikou one-on-one. Now, as superb as Taunt Wisp Mew was, it wasn't limited to that set, as it was also one of the best offensive threats around, and not one, but two guises. Both Nasty Plot and Swords Dance were excellent. But wait, how did you know which one it was? That question has a fun answer. You didn't. Did that make it more difficult to counter? Absolutely. Have fun switching your Bronzong into an assumed Swords Dance Mew and getting met with a Nasty Plot for your trouble, now having to switch around the threat of its massive Fire Blast. You would think faster offenses would be able to keep the Nasty Plot Mew in check, but nah, it was Swords Dance. And now it's packing priority, cleaving through your frailer hard hitters with boosted Sucker Punches as effectively as any Dark type. However, even if you know the set, it doesn't become much easier to handle thanks to Mew's speed and power, as well as great natural bulk, meaning it isn't exactly easy to take out even without bulk investment. It was thus a fixture on offenses. Whether it was boosting and hard hitting or taunt wisping its way through everything on more balanced teams, Mew was a UU superstar, capping off its first generation outside of Ubers with great success. Mewtwo got 2 Mega Evolutions. Mew got 0. On the bright side, Mew answered the call for stability in the face of Mega Field power creep. At first, Mew returned to UU, but it was still quite good in OU, so it looked like it was going to have a repeat of Gen 5. Mew was a star in XYUU. It formed the infamous Pink Core alongside Slowbro and Florges, the trio being incredibly good at taking on nearly the entire metagame with excellent longevity, bolstering their innate defensive prowess. Mew and Slowbro, who would also pair up on several OU teams, distributed burns quite nicely as well, so they weren't just sitting around being do-nothing walls, but instead putting on quite a bit of pressure. Later, Blissey would drop to UU, and the Pink Core expanded. Mew, Florges, Blissey, and either Slowbro or another Pink Regenerator water type Alomomola. Mew's excellence on UU balance and stall didn't last though. Before XY was even replaced by Oras, Mew had risen to OU alongside his common teammate Slowbro, funnily enough, for its ability to stand in in the way of an onslaught of offense. Its defensive capabilities were assisted somewhat by the lowering base powers of moves in Gen 6, with the likes of Draco Meteor and Hydro Pump getting knocked down by 10 BP. Being able to heal with leftovers without the burden of permanent sand was wonderful as well, as to was not having to contend with rain-boosted water moves. Beyond that, Mew's taunt Will-O-Wisp antics were as excellent as ever, even with more fire types running around. Talonflame and the Mega Charizards could be taken care of with Stealth Rock, while Mew wielded a buff knockoff to remove any Heatran's leftovers. With its specially defensive set, Mew was quite popular as an answer to the terror that was Protean Greninja, being tanky enough to withstand its Life Orb Hydro Pumps despite not resisting them, especially since it notably wasn't weak to any of its other coverage that Greninja of course had Stab on. Greninja started running Dark Pulse, in fact, specifically for Mew, but seeing as Greninja already had difficulties fitting all the coverage it wanted, and spikes for that matter, a good Mew user would take advantage of this to take it on with something else. Mew was commonly flanked by Alomomola, for example, which filled this purpose wonderfully. Plus, Mew was tanky enough to where it could stomach even a Dark Pulse. Auraz arrived, Greninja was banned, and Mew kept on trucking. It was quite simple, and yes, not having Ice Beam meant it was newly irritated by Gliscor, but it shut down so many Pokemon that it continued to see usage and success regardless. One of its most valuable traits, already seen in XY after the Aegislash ban, was its ability to shut down Mega Medicham, which very few Pokemon could do safely. Mega Medicham just got more and more popular as a response to the balanced teams dominating Auraz, and thus Mew remained valuable as an answer to a Pokemon that otherwise had a nasty habit of high jump kicking everything else into oblivion. Plus, Mega Medicham teams were generally lacking in Gliscor and in Pokemon that comfortably took Mew on in general, meaning it had an easy time spamming its Wisp antics. The few Pokemon that could threaten Mew, theoretically, like Bisharp, didn't actually want to switch into it. Taunt Wisp was eternal, always doing its thing with quiet consistency, but some players experimented with other Mew variants. The most common alternative Mew was the Defogger, which was commonly just the Taunt Wisp set, but with Defog over Taunt, and sometimes with a different coverage move over knockoff, depending on what hazard setters you wanted to target further, so as to be a more optimal anti-hazard tool. This Mew set could be a bit passive, since without Taunt, it struggled to force the issue against many defensive Pokemon, but Will-O-Wisp was such a great move that it made it work, and besides, the main appeal was that Mew was a Defogger with excellent bulk and longevity that was much harder to exploit than Auraz's alternatives. For all of Mew's flaws, it generally wasn't exploitable. It wasn't the easiest or most intuitive Pokemon to slot on the team, but Mew was arguably the most reliable pure Defogger in the tier, as far as actually staying alive was concerned, since it didn't either get dominated by hazard removal or trapping. Beyond that, some particularly creative players dipped into Mew's move pool to craft offbeat utility variants consisting of Heal Bell for various team support against Auraz's many status conditions, as well as Volt Switch, letting Mew turn its defensive profile into momentum. Overall though, Mew was an excellent Pokemon in Gen 6 OU, and almost perpetually underrated at that. Mew returned to UU in the Power Crept Gen 7, and in a stunning turn of events, wielded its stall-breaking Taunt Whiff set to superb effect. Even the half damage of Burn didn't much slow it down. It was perfectly content, as always, to gradually grind away at the opponent with Burn, Taunt, and its attacking move, whether the consistent damage of Seismic Toss, 100 HP at a time really adding up quickly with Burn, especially with Taunt Stifling Recovery, or good old Knockoff. Alternatively, it could run a pure utility set, usually with the Fog, although this time the setup looked different. Instead of always sticking with Wisps as it had before, it would now do the same with Taunt. Like with the Stall Breaker, Seismic Toss was the go-to, more so here, since it didn't have the possibility of passive damage from Wisps to accentuate Knockoff. You wanted to be able to do more damage than just Knockoff. It didn't have to run Defog either. It could also act as a highly reliable Stealth Rocker, with all those opportunities afforded it through its bulk and resist. Mew updating its old standby to continued success in this new gen was great, but it was also given a major revamp for a real blast of the past, emphasis on the blast. Its Nasty Plot variant was so successful in Gen 5 that UU was given new life with the explosive power, able to match anything in the new generation thanks to Munium Z, upgrading its Psychic into Genesis Supernova, which reached a cracking 185 base power and set Psychic terrain afterwards, ensuring the follow-up Psychics also hit tremendously hard. This worked beautifully as an unboosted bomb to be dropped at any time, or after a Nasty Plot, letting it rip through through just about anything, and if Psychic didn't do the job, it had all the coverage in the world to assist it. Nasty Plot Mew was generally less reliable than the utility variants though, which covered such an enormous portion of the metagame that they were almost too good to pass up on. Even in this incredibly strong UU tier, taking Mew down was a decidedly difficult task. Mew continued to have success in OU at the same time. In fact, even before UU was created, it continued to use its go-to sets, whose catch-all defensive nature was wonderful for dealing with everything from Alakazam to Zygarde. But what was really appreciated was how it took on the utterly monstrous Tapu Lele better than just about anything else. It was solid on offense and balance, but it particularly excelled at holding stall teams together. Many of the most successful structures leaned on Mew's ability to tank Tapu Lele, stall breaker extraordinaire, especially with Shed Shell sets popping up to escape the Dugtrio legal at the time, as well as, of course, Mega Medicham, and generally providing an ability to tank most everything while providing superb defogging utility. Even after Dugtrio's ban, Mew continued to feature on stall teams, and even after the increased power and defog distribution of Ultra Sun and Moon, Mew just kept at it, on stall and non-stall alike, though it was key on several of the particularly brutal double or even triple defog stall teams of the early era. Being able to handle the two unwallable Psychics in Tapu Lele and Mega Medicham was just incredible. Though it was most known for stall, it also featured on more balanced structures, offering its defensive defog support to threats like Mega Charizard Y. It was so key, in fact, that it actually rose out of UU and became OU proper. There were even some hyper-offensive teams that wielded an unusual Nasty Plot Rock Polish with Unium Z, which was incredibly adept at shredding fast offensive teams, anchoring on Pokemon like Kartana and Tapu Koko. Its powerful Fire Blast and great bulk meant even the catch-all Magearna wasn't slowing it down. Mew would eventually fall out of OU over a year later as it had become more specific, but it was still a great Pokemon, and even continued to develop new niches. Most notably, it saw use as a suicide Stealth Rock lead on hyper offense teams, its bulk preventing any need of a Focus Sash and allowing it to run the taunt-stifling Mental Herb, ensuring it would get up rocks before blowing up and leading the way for its monstrous boosting teammates like Volcarona, Mega Charizard X, Superior, Suicune, and Magearna. Upon returning to UU, Mew continued to thrive. It left the nasty plotting to the stall-shredding Celebi and its natural cure, as well as its monstrous stab Leaf Storm. If Mew were to stall break, which was very much in demand in a UU tier suffocating under the pressure of Blissey and its unaware friends, it would of course wield its signature set, the Taunt Wisp variant, and be just about impossible to take down. Gen 7 was another massive success for Mew. Mew lost Genesis Supernova in Gen 8's purging of Z Crystals, but it got some absolutely incredible new tools, which wound up being more impactful than its Z-move career had ever been. Its physical sweeping was given new life through improved stab. Forget Zen Headbutt, it now had the slightly stronger, perfectly accurate Psychic Fangs, which even nullified Reflect as counterplay. Furthermore, it could now unleash wicked redistribution to Dark types through close combat, and opposing Psychics would get thwacked by Poltergeist. The kicker was that it didn't just boost through Swords Dance anymore. Now it was both faster and stronger with Dragon Dance, making it a far greater general threat. The element of surprise contributed to this set's strength, but ultimately, the greatest addition to Mew's move pool in Gen 8, the one that worked timelessly even if you knew it was coming, was Spikes. Take all we've said about Mew's incredible support capabilities, now imagine all of those free turns it gets being used to throw down layer after layer, and this being Gen 8, everything's got heavy duty boots on, right? Ah yes, the boots that Mew dispatches effortlessly through the knockoff it already loved to spam. Indeed, for some time, the ultra-dominant Spikes Mew was at the forefront of UU. Its standard stall breaker set returned. Now it had to choose between Willow and Taunt, yes, but the upside was, well, Spikes. It was utterly nightmarish to answer because nothing save for Zarude wanted to switch into Will-O-Wisp and Knockoff. For most Pokemon, it was one or the other. Plus, the tier's hazard removal options, as if so often the case in many metagames across many generations, weren't exactly great, and the few good ones, like Salamence and Rotom Wash, didn't actually beat Mew. You'd defog the spikes away, and it'd come back in immediately as you did, popping them right back up. Funnily enough, Mew also loved wielding boots itself, as its longevity was incredible when it didn't have to manually heal off hazards, as it had so many other metas, and given the popularity of opposing Spikes Mew, you didn't want to fall behind with your own Mew. Indeed, the RBY Uber's S dynamic rubbed many UU players the wrong way. Mew was so overbearing, so arduous to handle, its effect on the metagame so warping, that it was seriously being considered for a ban, but the player base was saved the trouble when Mew rose to OU because, as it turns out, it was quite excellent there as well. Mew's OU niche partially included its classic stall-breaking antics, given its new spiking spin, of course. It could also potentially take over battles with an unusual but potentially brutal game ender of a set, Cosmic Power, which made it unkillable on both sides of the spectrum, and it used its immortality to boost repeatedly, which eventually allowed it to unleash wickedly boosted stab stored powers that cut through everything that wasn't a dark type. And for those dark types, it had a body press also boosted by Cosmic Power. If all you could muster were attacking moves, there was a pretty good chance this Mew would sweep you clean barring luck, but given its lack of taunt, it was also absurdly vulnerable to status and phasing, so it generally wasn't difficult to play around. Something like Toxic Melmetal, for example, would just ruin it forever. Mew generally shied away from such inconsistency. Its go-to set that really defined it was the Suicide lead, which now played like the layer-stacking Deoxys forms that had terrorized previous OU generations. Rocks, spikes, and taunt started games off beautifully, and then its final slot was dedicated to KOing itself to block Rapid Spin from Excadrill and generally provide safe entry for the teammate that was best suited to take advantage of the momentum Mew had set. Flare Blitz was popular because it kept Excadrill out to begin with, but seeing as Excadrill often wouldn't come in knowing it just get Flare Blitz, Mew could often leave that last move unrevealed until it was time to use it. That move was Misty Explosion, which was used over its regular explosion counterpart despite its lower power for the super effective coverage of Fairy, as well as the boost it potentially gained in Misty terrain. Not only did you have to contend with its quick, multi-layered hazards, with its taunt preventing you from getting your own, you now couldn't even status the threats coming at you for a few turns. And when those threats were things like Life Orb Weavile, and you couldn't even pray for a Flame Body burn, the game could quickly spiral out of control. Other threats like Dragonite and Rillaboom didn't take advantage of the Misty terrain, but the uncontested rocks, spikes, and momentum were all they needed. And so we chalk up another success from you in Generation 8. Power creep has finally come for Mew in Generation 9. Though to be fair, even the overwhelming onslaught of Gen 9 strength had additional help in the fact that Mew lost access to its healing moves. Without Soft Boiled or Roost, it's got to rely on Life Dew, which just isn't going to get the job done reliably. As a result, it's pretty much solely relegated to its more offensive variants. Those sets are great and all, but they're not overwhelming and usually work best as complements to the existence of Mew's traditional Stallbreaker sets, as opposed to its only options. As a result, Mew tumbled through the tiering rung. Forget UU, it landed in RU. It was no slouch though. Remember that this is now a boosting Mew with Terra up its sleeve. Mew is already a Pokemon of amazing unpredictability, and Terra amplifies this both offensively and defensively, with the latter often enhancing the latter. It did land in RU, yes, but it got banned from that tier twice. Its strength and versatility, both bolstered by the raw power and unpredictability of Terra, meant it ran circles around the tier and made all the ideas that base 100 across the board was no longer impressive look silly. Then the DLCs came along, and Mew dropped all the way to NU, where it was incredibly broken thanks to the Terra Fairy Nasty Plot set. As it turns out, Nasty Plot boosted Draining Kiss is pretty vicious when you can Terrasilize into a Fairy type, especially when you're normally answered by Dark types. Oh, but it gets better. Draining Kiss takes advantage of a unique Terra mechanic where non-multi-hit, priority, or variable base power moves below 60 BP get boosted up to 60, so it's hitting even harder than usual. 90 BP with the Terra-induced stab on a move that heals 75% of damage dealt on a Pokemon of Mew's bulk and special attack boosting, yeah, that gets out of hand. Plus, any poisons that would threaten your new type are ripped apart by Psychic Stab. Indeed, Mew basically reaps the benefits of Tapu Lele's stab combination while ensuring steals remain ever roasted by Fire Blast. Mew got banned from NU and took the set to RU, where it wasn't broken thanks to the presence of Pokemon like Gengar and Hisui and Gudra, but it was still quite good. But it still goes further, as Mew rose to UU proper in a manner reminiscent of the previous generation because its Suicide Hazard Stacker set was simply outstanding for hyper offense teams. You set the tempo with Mew, then you unleash a monstrous horde of sweepers on the opponent like Revavroom, Poltegeist, Low Kicks, and Thunderous Therian. Mew is even better at protecting its hazards too. Taunt stops the fog as usual, but Mew can even Terra Ghost to block Rapid Spin as well. With this all-encompassing hazard protection, it's referred to as Baby Goldango. That said, this is more a precaution than something it actually does in game regularly. It doesn't have to bother with Terra most of the time because the tier's hazard removal removal is mostly limited to the taunt bait that is Mandibuzz, or more commonly, the extra drill that is ruined by Will-O-Wisp, and then spin blocked by Poltergeist, or just outright decked by Flare Blitz, just like in Gen 8. Funnily enough, Mew's place in UU is slightly up in the air at the time of this video, as it rose to the tier in the same shift that brought Deoxys speed down from OU, and Mew of course competes directly with Deoxys speed. At the time of this video, it remains to be seen how this will develop, but it's very possible Mew retains viability thanks to its bulk, coverage, and amazing utility of Will-O-Wisp. Plus, if you run hazard stacking Mew lead, you can clean up with nasty plot Deoxys speed in the late game. Overall, Mew is thriving once again in Gen 9. Even with the most difficult gen for it yet, it has once again clawed its way back to UU. And that's it. So how great was Mew actually? Well, it's a tremendous competitive Pokemon. It started off in Ubers for the first 4 generations, being mandatory, then near mandatory in the first 2, then having a slight niche in the 3rd, then being the real deal once again in Gen 4. The latter 2 saw it discussed as a possible OU, which became realized in Gen 5. There it excelled in standard play, but actually dropped to UU, where it was tremendous as well. Its return to UU in Gen 6 was superb but brief, as it became OU proper for the first time, en route to helping keep the meta together against major power creep. It bounced between UU and OU again in Gen 7. It was true OU for a time in Ultra Sun and Moon, but even when it wasn't, it always had a valuable niche in how it countered monsters like Tapu Lele and Mega Medicham, while continuing to thrive in UU as ever. In Gen 8, it was so good in UU, it was potentially on its way to getting banned, but wound up being so good in OU, it rose to the tier naturally again, making the 3rd consecutive generation where that has happened, and the 2nd time where it stayed in OU outright, this time off the strength of its buff Suicide lead, set upon having gained spikes. Gen 9 was rough on it though, removing its recovery, but Mew has persevered, enlisting the power of terrestrialization to get itself banned from RU twice and NU once. It may have dropped low, but at least it pounded the daylights out of those tiers, and once again, its Suicide lead has risen it out of the tier it was in. It was a solid RU poke, but now it's true blue UU once again. So overall, Mew has a competitive history as fascinating as it is successful. Silencio. Thanks for watching, everyone. And as always, if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content. And I want to know, what do you think about competitive Mew? Would you buff it to have it go to OU? Whatever it is, let us know in the comments. Also, thank you so much to our patrons for continued support of our videos, and thank you to everyone else watching as well. And thank you so much to our Platinum patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Bingleton, Daniel Isbeast, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Megamon VGC, Nurse Jake, Jack G, Pretzel SP, Spavoon, Skylaria, Soros and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Kiboflu for their major support of our videos. And follow my crew on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.